Hello, my friend. Yes, you, the one watching this video at 11 at night, or maybe early in the morning before work, with your notebook open, with 3 English apps on your phone, with a folder full of grammar rules you have studied maybe 10 times. I want you to stop for 1 second. Stop scrolling. Stop searching for the one trick that will finally make you speak English, because I am going to tell you something that might feel strange to hear, something that maybe no other teacher has told you before. You do not have an English problem, you have a translation problem. Right now, somewhere in your brain there is a very hard-working, very tired little translator. Every single time you want to say something in English, this translator wakes up, it listens to the sentence in your own language, in your mother tongue, and then it starts working. It searches for the right words, it checks the grammar, it rearranges the sentence, it worries about the tense, it worries about the accent, and only after all of that heavy, exhausting work, finally, slowly, sometimes too late, the sentence comes out of your mouth. And by that time, the conversation has already moved on. The other person is already talking about something else, and you are left standing there, feeling stupid, feeling small, feeling like you will never ever be fluent. I know this feeling. I have seen it in thousands of students over the years. The engineer who can read English research papers perfectly, but freezes when a colleague asks him a simple question in a meeting. The mother who can write beautiful English emails, but cannot say a full sentence when she picks up her child from an international school, and another parent says hello to her. The young woman who has studied English grammar for 12 years, who knows the difference between the present perfect and the past simple better than most native speakers, but who still feels her heart racing, her hands sweating, her mind going completely blank, the moment she needs to actually open her mouth and speak. If this is you, I want you to know something very important right now, in the first minute of this video. This is not because you are not smart enough. This is not because you do not know enough words. This is not because your brain is somehow broken or slow. This is because of one simple, biological, scientific fact. Your brain is currently using the wrong system to speak English. You are using your thinking brain, your slow, careful, translating brain, for a job that should belong to your automatic brain, your fast, instinctive, reflex brain. And in the next 30 days, together, step by step, we are going to move English out of your thinking brain and into your automatic brain. We are going to rewire you. My name is Professor Henry, and this is English Mind Training. I have spent many years studying not just how to teach English words and rules, but how the human brain actually learns to speak any language automatically, without translating, without hesitating, without fear. And what I discovered changed everything about how I teach. I discovered that fluency is not a knowledge problem. Fluency is a wiring problem, and wiring problems have wiring solutions. So here is my promise to you today. If you stay with me for this video, and if you commit to the 30-day path I am going to lay out for you, chapter by chapter, you are going to understand exactly why your brain freezes, exactly why translation is destroying your fluency, and exactly what daily actions, done in the right order, will rebuild your English brain from the ground up. This is not a video about memorizing more vocabulary lists. This is not a video about learning one more grammar rule. This is a video about changing the actual machinery in your head that produces speech. By the end of this video, you will have a complete mental map of how automatic English speaking is built, and you will know precisely what to do, starting today, this very hour, to begin that transformation. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you to do one small thing. If you are serious, if you are truly tired of feeling stuck, tired of understanding everything but saying nothing, tired of watching movies in English perfectly, but freezing in real conversations, then stay until the end. Because I am going to save the most powerful chapter, the one exercise that changed everything for my most successful students, for the very end of this video. Do not skip ahead. Let us build this together, piece by piece, the way your brain actually needs to learn it. Let us begin. Why your brain translates, and why that is destroying your fluency. Let me start with a question. When you were a small child, learning your first language, your mother tongue, did you ever sit down with a grammar book before you spoke your first sentence? Did you ever study the rules of subject and verb agreement before you said the word for water, or mama, or more? Of course not. No child does this. No child needs this. And yet every single child on this planet, without exception, unless there is a medical condition, learns to speak their first language fluently, automatically, without translating from anywhere, because there is nowhere else to translate from. There is only the language itself, absorbed through the ears, connected directly to meaning, connected directly to emotion, connected directly to action. Now compare this to how most of us were taught English in school. We were given a textbook. We were given a list of words with translations next to them in our own language. We were given grammar rules to memorize, tables to fill in, tests to pass. Word became attached to translation, not to meaning. Grammar became attached to rules, not to feeling. And so, without anyone intending this to happen, we built a very specific kind of brain wiring. We built a brain that, when it hears or wants to produce English, automatically activates the mother tongue first. This is called the translation pathway, and once it is built, once it becomes strong through years of repetition, it becomes the default, automatic route your brain takes every single time. This is not your fault. I want to say this very clearly because so many of my students carry shame about this, as if slow speaking means they are not intelligent. The opposite is true. Translation is actually a sign of a very active, very analytical mind. Your brain is working incredibly hard, harder than a native speaker's brain in fact, because it is doing two jobs at once. It is thinking of the idea, and then it is converting that idea through an entire second language system before producing sound. Imagine trying to run while carrying a heavy bag on your back. You can still run, but you will be slow, you will be tired, and you will never feel light or free. Here is the scientific reality behind this. Inside your brain, language processing happens through neural pathways, which are essentially chains of connected brain cells that fire together every time you perform a certain mental action. When you first learned English through translation methods, you built a pathway that looks something like this. English word or sentence comes in, signal travels to the area of your brain associated with your mother tongue. Mother tongue meaning is retrieved. Signal travels back through a search for the correct English structure. English output is finally produced. This pathway, because you have used it so many times, has become thick, strong, and fast to activate, almost like a well-worn path through a forest. Meanwhile, the direct pathway, English sound connected straight to meaning, connected straight to output, without any detour through your first language, remains thin, weak, and underused, like a path that has barely been walked, covered in grass, easy to lose. This is why, no matter how many words you memorize, no matter how many grammar rules you understand perfectly in your head, speaking still feels slow and effortful. You are still walking the long path, the translation path, every single time. And here is the truly frustrating part, the part I want you to really absorb. The more grammar rules you memorize in isolation, without connecting them to real spoken use, the stronger you can actually make this slow translation pathway. Because every time you consciously apply a rule while speaking, you are reinforcing the habit of stopping, checking, translating, adjusting before speaking. You are training your brain to be a careful editor, not a natural speaker. So what is the solution? The solution is not to abandon grammar or vocabulary. Those things matter, and we will talk about how to use them correctly later in this program. The solution is to deliberately, consciously, and repeatedly build that second pathway, the direct pathway, until it becomes stronger, faster, and more automatic than the translation pathway. This is what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself, to grow new connections, to strengthen pathways that are used often, and to weaken pathways that fall into disuse. Your brain is not fixed. It is not finished developing just because you are an adult. Every single day, based on what you practice and how you practice it, your brain is quietly rewiring itself. The question is simply whether you are rewiring it on purpose, with a method, or by accident, through years of habits that do not serve your goal of speaking automatically. This is exactly why this program exists. Over the next 30 days, we are not simply going to add more English knowledge to your head. We are going to systematically weaken the translation pathway and systematically strengthen the direct pathway, using specific science-backed daily practices designed for exactly this purpose. Some of what I teach you may feel unusual at first, because it is different from the traditional classroom methods you may have experienced before. But I ask you to trust the process, because this is not guesswork. This is based on how language actually lives in the human brain, how children acquire it naturally, and how thousands of adult learners, just like you, have successfully rewired themselves to speak fluently and automatically, without translating, without freezing, without fear. In the next chapter, we are going to go even deeper into this idea by looking closely at how babies and young children acquire language, because inside that natural process is hidden the exact blueprint we are going to follow for the next 30 days. Stay with me. This is where it gets truly interesting.
Nudging Pavilion, and why rushing to speak is keeping you stuck.
I want you to picture a baby, maybe 8 months old, sitting on the floor, surrounded by family members who are talking, laughing, singing, calling her name. This baby is not speaking yet. She will not say her first real word for several more months. But is she doing nothing? Absolutely not. She is doing the single most important work of language acquisition, work that most adult English learners skip entirely, and this skipping is one of the biggest reasons speaking feels so hard. This period is called the silent period, and every single human being who has ever learned a first language has gone through it, without exception. During this time, the baby is listening, constantly, hungrily, without any pressure to produce anything. She is absorbing the rhythm of the language, the music of it, the way the voice rises at the end of a question and falls at the end of a statement. She is absorbing which sounds come before which other sounds. She is silently building an enormous internal map of the language long before she ever attempts to use it herself. By the time she says her first word, her brain has already heard that language for thousands and thousands of hours. The speaking, when it finally arrives, is not the beginning of learning. It is the visible result of an invisible process that has already been happening for a very long time. Now let me ask you something honestly. When you started learning English, did you get a silent period like this? Or were you, from the very first lesson, immediately asked to speak, to answer questions, to produce sentences, to perform, often in front of your classmates, often being corrected the moment you made a mistake? Most of us were thrown directly into production, directly into speaking and writing, with almost no protected time simply to listen, absorb, and build that internal map first. This is like asking someone to start playing a beautiful piece of music on the piano before they have ever heard the melody. Of course, the result will feel forced, mechanical, and full of errors, not because the person lacks talent, but because they were never given the chance to absorb the sound first. This is one of the most important shifts I need you to make in your thinking during this 30-day program. For at least the first portion of each day, and especially in the early days of this program, your job is not to force yourself to speak more. Your job is to listen more, and to listen in a very specific, active way that I am going to describe in detail later in this program. I call this immersive absorption, and it is completely different from passively having a television show playing in the background while you check your phone. Immersive absorption means you are truly present with the sound of English, letting your ear adjust to its rhythm, its stress patterns, its music, without the pressure of needing to understand every single word, and certainly without the pressure of needing to translate every single word. Here is something remarkable that happens during this kind of listening, something that most learners never realize is happening. Even when you do not consciously understand a sentence, your brain is still processing patterns. It is noticing, at a level below your conscious awareness, that certain words tend to appear near certain other words. It is noticing that questions have a particular melody. It is noticing that certain grammar structures repeat again and again in daily conversation, much more often than the rare, complicated structures that fill up traditional grammar textbooks. This pattern recognition is exactly how your first language became automatic, and it is exactly how English can become automatic too, if you give your brain enough exposure of the right kind. I often meet students who tell me, "Professor Henry, I have already watched hundreds of hours of English movies and television shows, and I still cannot speak. Why did this not work for me?" And when I dig deeper into their habits, I almost always find the same problem. They were watching with subtitles in their own language, which meant their brain was still relying on the translation pathway the entire time, never being forced to build that direct connection between English sound and English meaning. Or they were watching passively, half paying attention, using it as background noise while doing other tasks, which means very little deep processing was actually happening. Real immersive absorption requires your full attention, requires you to resist the urge to translate every unfamiliar word immediately, and requires you to trust that meaning will become clear over time, through repetition and context, exactly the way it did when you were a small child learning your first language. I know this feels uncomfortable for many adult learners. We are used to wanting to understand everything immediately. We feel anxious when we do not know a word. we want to look it up right away. But I want to gently challenge you here. That anxiety, that need for immediate, complete understanding, is actually part of what keeps the translation pathway so strong and so dominant. Every time you stop, look up a word, translate it, and only then continue, you are again reinforcing the slow pathway. Learning to tolerate a little bit of uncertainty, learning to let your brain sit with partial understanding and trust that clarity will come with more exposure is itself a skill, and it is a skill we will be training deliberately throughout this program. So starting today, I want you to begin thinking of listening not as a passive activity you do while waiting to speak, but as the active foundation upon which all real speaking ability is built. In the coming chapters, I will give you exact, practical methods for how to structure this listening so that it builds your automatic English brain as efficiently as possible, methods far more targeted than simply watching random content. But for now, I want this one idea to settle deeply into your mind. You are not behind because you cannot speak fluently yet. You are simply in your silent period, a period that every successful language learner has passed through, whether they realized it or not. The question is only whether you will use this period consciously and strategically, the way we are about to teach you, or whether you will continue fighting against it, forcing speech before the foundation is ready, and feeling exhausted and discouraged as a result. In the next chapter, we go deeper into the actual brain science of how repetition and specific types of practice physically change the structure of your brain, and why this means your current struggle is temporary, not permanent. The science of rewiring, how your brain physically changes when you learn to speak automatically. I want to take a few minutes now to explain in simple and clear terms what is actually happening inside your brain when you practice English in the right way, because understanding this will give you patience with yourself, and patience is something every single one of my successful students has needed in large amounts. Your brain is made up of billions of cells called neurons, and these neurons communicate with each other across tiny gaps called synapses. Every single thought you have, every word you understand, every sentence you produce happens because specific groups of neurons fire together in specific patterns. Here is the key fact that changes everything. When a group of neurons fires together repeatedly, the connection between them becomes physically stronger, the synapse becomes more efficient, signals travel faster and more easily along that particular pathway the next time. This is often summarized by neuroscientists with a simple phrase: neurons that fire together, wire together. And the opposite is also true. Pathways that are rarely used become weaker over time, a process called synaptic pruning, where the brain essentially clears away connections it does not consider important in order to make room for the connections it uses often. This means something very hopeful for you. Right now, your translation pathway is strong simply because you have used it so many times, not because it is somehow the correct or permanent way your brain must work. And your direct English pathway, the one that connects English sounds straight to meaning and straight to spoken output without any detour, is currently weak, not because you lack ability, but simply because it has not yet been used enough times to become strong. Strength in the brain is not fixed, it is earned through repetition, and specifically through a particular kind of repetition that I am going to describe carefully, because not all repetition produces the same results. There is an important difference between what I call passive repetition and active production repetition. Passive repetition is when you read the same grammar rule again and again, or when you listen to the same vocabulary list on repeat. This kind of repetition does build some familiarity, and it is not useless, but on its own, it does very little to build the specific pathway needed for automatic speech, because it never requires your brain to actually produce spoken output under the pressure of real-time communication. Active production repetition, on the other hand, is when you actually speak out loud using a specific structure or pattern many times in slightly varied situations until the muscles of your mouth, the neural pathways of your brain, and the timing of your speech all become coordinated and fast without conscious effort. Think about how you learnt to walk. You did not learn to walk by reading about the biomechanics of walking. You learnt to walk by falling down over and over, thousands of times, until your brain and your muscles built an automatic, coordinated pattern that now requires no conscious thought at all. You never think, now I will shift my weight to my left leg while lifting my right knee. Your brain handles all of this automatically because the pathway has been built so strongly through repeated physical practice that it has become what scientists call procedural memory, a type of memory that operates below conscious awareness, fast, automatic, and reliable, completely different from the conscious, effortful memory you use to recall a fact or a rule. Fluent speech is, in a very real sense, procedural memory. It is not primarily stored as a set of facts and rules that you consciously access one at a time. In a truly fluent speaker, speech flows the way walking flows, automatically, coordinated with the conscious mind free to focus on the meaning and the message rather than on the mechanics of production. This is precisely why so many advanced English learners, people who can explain every grammar rule in perfect detail, still speak slowly and hesitantly. Their knowledge of English exists primarily as conscious, factual memory, the kind used for reciting rules, not as procedural memory, the kind used for automatic speech. These are, quite literally, different systems in the brain, stored in different regions, accessed in different ways. And this is also exactly why simply learning more grammar rules will never, on its own, solve the fluency problem. You cannot think your way into automatic speech. You must build it through repeated, active, spoken practice, the same way you built the automatic pattern of walking. This is the entire foundation of the 30-day program we are building together in this video. Every single practice I am going to recommend to you is designed specifically to build procedural memory for English, not simply factual knowledge about English. This means, and I want to be very direct with you here, that reading this script or watching videos like this one, while valuable for understanding the method and staying motivated, is not by itself going to make you fluent. You must combine this understanding with actual daily spoken practice in the specific ways I will describe for the rewiring to actually happen. Understanding the map is important, but only walking the actual path will get you to the destination. I also want to address something that discourages many adult learners deeply, the fear that adult brains simply cannot rewire themselves the way a child's brain can. This fear, while understandable, is largely a myth, at least when it comes to the amount of change actually required for fluent automatic speaking. It is true that young children have a particular sensitivity that makes native-like pronunciations somewhat easier to acquire without effort. But the core mechanism of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to strengthen and build new neural pathways through repeated use, remains active throughout your entire life, well into old age. Adults who commit to the right kind of practice, consistently, over weeks and months, do successfully rewire their brains for fluent automatic speech in a second language, every single day, all around the world. Your age is not the barrier. Your method has been the barrier, and today that changes. In the next chapter, we are going to address something even more important than method, something that for many of my students has turned out to be the single biggest obstacle standing between them and fluent English speech. We are going to talk about fear, and about the very specific way fear physically shuts down your ability to access the English you already know. Kai-illing the fear, why your brain blocks words you already know. Let me describe a moment that I am certain many of you watching this video have experienced, because I have heard this exact story, with only small variations, from hundreds of students over the years. You are in a meeting, or at a party, or in a shop, and someone asks you a question in English. And in that moment, even though you know the answer, even though you have used this exact vocabulary 100 times while studying alone at home, your mind goes completely blank. Nothing comes out. Or perhaps something comes out, but it is broken, stumbling, full of pauses, nothing like the fluent sentences you can produce when you are calm, alone, practicing in front of a mirror. Afterward, walking away from that conversation, the words suddenly return to you, perfectly formed, 5 minutes too late. This experience is so common and so painful that I want to spend this entire chapter explaining exactly why it happens, because once you understand the mechanism, you gain real power over it. Here is what is happening in simple biological terms. Deep inside your brain, there is a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala's job, developed over millions of years of evolution, is to detect threat and trigger a rapid protective response, commonly known as fight, flight, or freeze. This system was designed to protect our ancestors from physical dangers, a predator in the grass, a threat from a rival group. But here is the critical problem for language learners. The amygdala does not clearly distinguish between a physical danger and a social danger, such as the fear of embarrassing yourself, the fear of being judged, the fear of making a mistake in front of other people. to your amygdala, the possibility of speaking incorrectly in front of a colleague can register as a genuine threat, almost as urgent as physical danger, especially if you have had painful experiences in the past, perhaps being laughed at, corrected harshly, or made to feel stupid because of your English. When the amygdala perceives this kind of threat, it triggers a cascade of physiological responses. Stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline flood your system, your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes shallow and quick, and critically, blood flow and neural resources are redirected away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for complex thought, careful language retrieval, and conscious decision-making, and redirected instead toward the more primitive systems responsible for immediate physical survival. In other words, in the exact moment you need your thinking brain most, to retrieve vocabulary and construct sentences, your body is biologically prioritizing survival systems over language systems. This is not weakness. This is not a personal failure. This is a hardwired biological response that has kept humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years, now unfortunately misapplied to the modern situation of speaking a second language in a social setting. This is precisely why you can speak perfectly alone in your room, but freeze in a real conversation. Alone in your room, there is no perceived social threat, so your amygdala remains calm, and your prefrontal cortex has full access to the vocabulary and grammar structures you have studied. But the moment a real person is watching you, listening to you, potentially judging you, that threat detection system activates, and your access to language, quite literally, becomes physically restricted. This is why simply knowing more words will never solve this problem on its own. You could double your vocabulary, and if your amygdala remains highly reactive to the social threat of speaking, you will still freeze, because the problem is not a lack of knowledge, it is blocked access to knowledge you already possess. So what can actually be done about this? The good news is that the amygdala's threat response is not fixed either. It too can be retrained, calmed, and desensitized over time, through specific, deliberate practice, in exactly the same way we retrain the language pathways themselves. There are 3 specific strategies I want to give you here, strategies we will build into your daily 30-day plan, and I want you to understand not just what they are, but why they work at this deep biological level. The first strategy is what I call graduated exposure. This means you do not begin your speaking practice in the highest pressure situations, such as an important meeting or a job interview. Instead, you begin in the lowest pressure situations possible, speaking alone out loud, then speaking to a supportive friend or family member, then speaking in low-stakes online conversations with other learners, gradually working your way up to higher pressure situations only once each level feels comfortable. Every time you successfully complete a speaking interaction without a real negative consequence occurring, your amygdala receives new evidence that speaking English is in fact safe. Over enough repetitions, this new evidence begins to override the old, fear-based associations, and the threat response naturally weakens. The second strategy is breath regulation, and I know this may sound disconnected from language learning, but I promise you it is deeply connected. When you feel that familiar rising panic just before speaking, your breathing typically becomes fast and shallow, which itself signals to your nervous system that a threat is present, creating a feedback loop that intensifies the fear response even further. By consciously slowing your breath, taking a slow inhale through your nose, holding briefly, and exhaling slowly, even for just a few seconds before you speak, you send a direct physiological signal back to your nervous system that you are safe, which measurably reduces amygdala activation and restores access to your prefrontal cortex. This is not a mystical trick, it is well-documented physiology, and I want you to genuinely practice this, not just hear about it, in the practical exercises later in this program. The third strategy, and perhaps the most important one for long-term change, is redefining what a mistake actually means to your nervous system. Many of us were raised in educational systems where a language mistake was treated as a failure, something to be corrected, sometimes publicly, sometimes with visible disapproval from a teacher or classmates. This creates a deep emotional association between speaking English and the risk of humiliation. But here is the truth I need you to absorb fully. Every single fluent speaker of every language on earth made an enormous number of mistakes on their way to fluency. Mistakes are not evidence that you are failing to learn English. Mistakes are the actual mechanism by which you learn English. Every mistake, when noticed and gently corrected, provides your brain with exactly the information it needs to adjust and improve the relevant neural pathway. A speaker who never makes mistakes is not more advanced. They are simply speaking within a smaller, safer range, avoiding growth. I want you to begin consciously, deliberately, choosing to see mistakes not as evidence of failure, but as proof that you are actively training, actively pushing the boundary of your ability, exactly where growth happens. Over the coming days of this program, I am going to ask you to practice speaking even when you feel that familiar fear rising, not by ignoring the fear, but by working with your body directly, using breath, using graduated exposure, and using this reframed relationship with mistakes, until speaking English no longer triggers that old threat response, and your full knowledge becomes reliably available to you, exactly when you need it, in real conversations, under real pressure, with real people. In the next chapter, we move into the specific, structured input method that begins the actual 30-day rewiring process, starting with how to train your ear before you train your mouth. The 30-day immersion method, training your ear before your mouth. Now that you understand why translation happens, why the silent period matters, how your brain physically rewires itself, and how fear blocks access to language you already know, we are ready to begin building the actual 30-day structure together, starting with the most foundational element of all, training your ear. I want to explain something that surprises many of my students. The order in which you train your skills matters enormously. If you try to train your mouth to produce fluent English before your ear has been properly trained to recognize the natural rhythm, stress, and flow of English, you end up building speech patterns that feel foreign and effortful, because you are essentially trying to produce a sound you have not yet deeply internalized. This is similar to trying to sing a song correctly before you have ever actually heard the melody clearly. You might get some notes right by accident, but the overall performance will feel disconnected and unnatural. This is why the first 10 days of our 30-day program focus heavily, though not exclusively, on a very specific kind of listening training designed to build a deep automatic recognition of English sound patterns before we place heavy demands on spoken production. Here is exactly how this works in practice. Each day, you are going to select a short piece of spoken English content, ideally between 2 and 5 minutes in length. This could be a simple conversation, a short talk, a segment of a podcast, anything spoken at a natural conversational pace, not artificially slowed down. The length matters here because shorter, focused segments allow for the kind of deep, repeated engagement that actually builds pathways, compared to passively watching hours of content that wash over you without deep processing. Quality of engagement matters far more than quantity of exposure. Your first listening pass through this content should be done with absolutely no subtitles and without pausing to look up unfamiliar words. I know this feels uncomfortable, especially at first, but I want you to trust the process here. Your goal on this first pass is not complete understanding. Your goal is simply to let your ear absorb the overall rhythm, the melody, the general shape of the conversation. Notice where the speaker's voice rises and falls. Notice which words seem to be stressed, spoken slightly louder or longer than the words around them, because in English, stress patterns carry enormous meaning, often more meaning than the actual words themselves. Let yourself catch what you catch, and let the rest simply wash past you, without anxiety, without the urge to pause and translate. On your second pass through the same content, now you may turn on English subtitles, not subtitles in your own language, but English subtitles, so that you can begin to connect the sounds you heard with the actual written words producing them. This step is important because it helps your brain build clear, accurate connections between sound and word, correcting any misunderstandings that occurred during the first pass, while still keeping you fully inside the English language system without crossing back into your mother tongue. On your third pass, I want you to actively shadow the speaker. Shadowing means speaking along with the recording at the same time as the speaker, matching their rhythm, their pace, their stress and intonation as closely as you possibly can, even if you do not fully understand every single word you are saying in this moment. This may feel strange at first, almost like acting or mimicking rather than truly speaking, and that is exactly correct. That is exactly the point. At this stage, you are training the physical, muscular, and rhythmic patterns of English speech, training your mouth and your ear to work together automatically, separate from the cognitive work of constructing original sentences, which we will build in later chapters. Shadowing is one of the single most powerful exercises for building natural-sounding, automatic English rhythm, and I want you to take it seriously, even though it can feel a little uncomfortable or even silly at first. Every fluent speaker I have ever worked with who used this method consistently reported a noticeable shift in how natural their English began to sound within just the first 2 weeks. I also want to address a common question at this point. Should you choose content about topics that interest you personally, or should you follow a structured course with predetermined topics? My strong recommendation, based on what I have observed with successful students over many years, is to prioritize genuine personal interest whenever possible. If you love cooking, listen to English cooking videos. If you love football, listen to English football commentary and interviews. If you love business, listen to English business discussions. Emotional engagement and genuine interest significantly increase the depth of memory formation and the strength of the neural connections being built. A boring, disconnected topic, chosen only because it appears on a structured syllabus, will simply not create the same depth of engagement, no matter how grammatically perfect the content might be. I want to close this chapter with an important reassurance. During these first days of focused listening and shadowing practice, you may feel like you are not yet speaking real, original English, and this can feel frustrating if you are eager to have real conversations immediately. I understand this impatience deeply, and I promise you, we are building toward real conversational ability very soon, starting in the next chapter, where we introduce the concept of thinking directly in English. But please trust that this listening foundation is not a delay on your path to fluency. It is the actual construction of the foundation upon which fluent automatic speech will be built. Skip this foundation, and speech remains effortful and translated. Build this foundation properly, and everything that follows becomes dramatically easier, faster, and more natural. In the next chapter, we take the crucial next step, moving from absorbing English sound patterns to actually beginning to think directly in English, which is the true bridge between passive understanding and automatic, confident speech. Thinking in English, the bridge between understanding and automatic speech. There is a moment that every one of my successful students describes, a kind of turning point, and they almost always describe it in the same way, even though they come from completely different countries and completely different native languages. They tell me, Professor Henry, something changed. I stopped translating in my head. I just started thinking directly in English, and once that happened, everything became easier. This moment, the shift from thinking in your own language and translating to actually thinking directly in English, is the true bridge between passive understanding and real, automatic, confident speech. And I want to explain to you exactly how to build this bridge deliberately, because it does not simply happen by accident after enough time has passed. It happens through specific, targeted practice, which I am going to walk you through step by step in this chapter. Let us start by understanding what thinking in English actually means, because many learners misunderstand this concept. Thinking in English does not mean you are constantly narrating your entire day in perfect English sentences inside your head, like a formal essay running continuously in your mind. Thinking in English simply means that when a simple idea, observation, or intention arises in your mind, an English word or phrase for it comes to mind first, or at the same time, rather than your mother tongue word coming first, followed by a mental search for the English translation. It is a shift in the order and speed of mental access, not a demand for constant, perfect internal narration. Here is the first exercise I want you to begin practicing immediately, starting today, and I want you to understand exactly why it works before I describe it. I call this the labeling exercise. As you move through your day, doing ordinary things, making coffee, walking to your car, washing dishes, waiting for a bus, I want you to silently label the objects and actions around you in English, in the moment, as you interact with them. Not writing them down, not speaking them aloud necessarily, though you can if you are alone, simply noticing them and silently naming them in English as they happen. The cup, the door, I am opening the door, the rain, it is raining. This exercise feels extremely simple, almost too simple to matter, but I want you to understand why it is actually one of the most powerful tools available to you. The reason this exercise works so effectively is that it builds a direct, unmediated connection between real-world objects and actions and their English labels without ever passing through your mother tongue at all. You are not translating the cup into English. You are simply, directly, associating the actual physical cup in front of you with the English word cup. This is exactly how a child builds vocabulary. direct association between object and word, without any translation step involved, because a young child, of course, has no other language yet to translate from. By deliberately practicing this kind of direct labeling as an adult, you are essentially recreating, on purpose, the same direct pathway building process that happened naturally and effortlessly during your childhood language acquisition. I want you to practice this labeling exercise for at least 10 to 15 minutes each day, though of course, the more you incorporate it naturally throughout your day, the faster your progress will be. Some of my students eventually reach a point where they are doing this almost constantly throughout every waking hour without even needing to consciously remind themselves because the habit has become automatic. This is exactly the goal. The second exercise I want to introduce here is what I call internal narration, and this builds directly on the labeling exercise, extending it into slightly more complex thoughts. Once you feel comfortable simply labeling objects and actions, I want you to begin narrating short, simple observations about your immediate experience, silently, in English, as they occur. I am tired. The coffee is too hot. I need to leave soon. This bag is heavy. Notice that these are not complicated sentences. They do not need to be grammatically perfect. The goal here is not to produce impressive English. The goal is to practice the mental habit of accessing English directly for your own real, immediate thoughts, rather than only accessing English when you are specifically studying or completing an exercise from a textbook. I know that some of you, especially in the early days, will find that a thought arises first in your mother tongue, and only afterward do you consciously convert it to English. This is completely normal, and I do not want you to feel discouraged by this. Remember what we discussed about neuroplasticity. Every single time you consciously choose to shift a thought into English, even if it started in your mother tongue, you are still strengthening the English pathway through the practice of expressing that thought in English. Over time, with enough repetition, the starting point of the thought itself gradually begins shifting toward English as well, particularly for the categories of thoughts you practice most frequently. This shift does not happen overnight, and I do not want to promise you a magical instant transformation. But I have watched this shift happen reliably, consistently, in student after student, when this practice is maintained daily over the course of several weeks. There is a third, slightly more advanced exercise I want to give you here as well, one that I typically introduce once the first two exercises feel comfortable, usually somewhere around the second week of practice. I call this predictive rehearsal. Before you enter a situation where you know you will likely need to speak English, perhaps a meeting, a phone call, an interaction at a shop, I want you to spend just a minute or two beforehand silently rehearsing, in English, in your mind, the kinds of things you might say or need to say in that situation. This is not about writing a perfect script and memorizing it word for word, because real conversations never actually follow a fixed script. It is about warming up the relevant vocabulary and mental pathways in advance, so that when the real moment arrives, your brain has already primed the relevant English content, making it far more accessible in real time under the pressure of the actual conversation. Many of my students who work in professional environments have told me that this simple predictive rehearsal exercise, done consistently before important meetings or calls, dramatically reduced their anxiety and dramatically improved their ability to speak smoothly in those high-pressure moments. This is not because the exercise gives them new knowledge they did not already have. It is because the exercise activates and strengthens the relevant pathways just before they are needed, similar to how an athlete might mentally rehearse their movements just before a competition, priming the neural pathways for immediate, automatic access. I want to be very clear about something important here. These exercises, labeling, internal narration, and predictive rehearsal, are not separate from real life. They are designed to be woven directly into your real, ordinary daily existence, requiring no special equipment, no extra time carved out of your schedule, no textbook open in front of you. This is precisely why they are so effective at building automatic, natural English ability, rather than the kind of textbook English that remains disconnected from real, spontaneous thought and speech. English, when learnt this way, becomes attached not to a classroom, not to a test, not to a book, but to your actual, lived, daily experience, exactly the way your first language became attached to your life many years ago, without you ever consciously trying to make that happen. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about something that many learners underestimate completely, the true power of repetition, and specifically, why the particular kind of repetition I am about to describe is so much more effective than simply reviewing material again and again in the way most traditional study methods encourage. The power of repetition, how small daily actions become permanent instinct. I want to begin this chapter with a simple but important truth, one that I have found genuinely surprises many adult learners when they first hear it clearly stated. Fluency is not built through occasional, intense study sessions. Fluency is built through small, consistent, daily repetition, sustained over weeks and months, far more than it is built through a few long, exhausting study marathons scattered occasionally throughout your schedule. This might sound like fairly ordinary advice, the kind of thing you have perhaps heard before in a general sense. Consistency matters, practice every day. But I want to go much deeper here, because understanding exactly why this is true, at the level of how memory and skill actually form in the brain, will change how seriously you take this principle, and will help you resist the temptation to abandon daily practice on the days when motivation feels low. There is a well-documented phenomenon in memory science called the forgetting curve. When you learn something new, whether a fact, a word, or a physical skill, your memory of that new information begins to fade almost immediately, often quite rapidly, within the first hours and days after learning it, unless that information is reinforced through repeated exposure. However, here is the critical detail that makes daily practice so powerful. Each time you successfully retrieve or practice that piece of information again, before it has been completely forgotten, the memory becomes stronger, and importantly, the rate at which it fades afterward becomes slower. In other words, repeated retrieval, spaced out over time, does not simply add up in a straight line. It compounds, making each new piece of learning progressively more durable, more resistant to forgetting, and eventually permanent. This is precisely why studying intensely for 8 hours once a week produces dramatically worse long-term results than studying actively for even just 20 or 30 minutes every single day. In the 8-hour session, you may feel in the moment like you are absorbing an enormous amount of information, and in a sense, you are, temporarily. But without daily reinforcement, the vast majority of that information will fade significantly before your next study session a full week later, meaning much of that effort must essentially be relearned from a weakened starting point each time. Daily practice, by contrast, catches the memory before it fades, reinforcing it while it is still relatively fresh, building steadily increasing strength and durability with each passing day. This principle applies not only to vocabulary and grammar knowledge, but even more powerfully to the procedural, automatic speaking ability we discussed earlier in this program. Remember, automatic speech is closer to a physical skill, like walking or riding a bicycle, than it is to simple factual knowledge, and physical skills, perhaps even more than factual knowledge, depend heavily on frequent, consistent practice to become truly automatic. A person who practices playing a musical instrument for 20 minutes every single day will, almost without exception, surpass a person who practices for several hours only once a week, even though the total practice time across the week might be similar or even less in the daily case. Frequency, consistency, and regularity matter enormously for building automatic, embodied skill, arguably more than total accumulated hours matter. I want to share something else here that I have observed consistently across many years of teaching, something I consider one of the most important psychological insights of this entire program. The students who succeed, who genuinely transform from hesitant, translating speakers into confident, automatic English speakers, are almost never the students with the most natural talent, or the most free time, or the most expensive resources. They are, almost without exception, simply the students who showed up every single day, even when the practice session was short, even when motivation was low, even when progress felt invisible on any particular day. Small, consistent daily action, repeated over 30 days, and ideally well beyond 30 days, produces results that occasional, intense bursts of effort simply cannot match, no matter how much energy or enthusiasm goes into those occasional bursts. This is exactly why this program is structured as a 30-day daily commitment, rather than a single intensive course to complete once and set aside. I am not asking you to find several hours each day. In fact, I specifically want you to resist the urge to attempt long, exhausting daily sessions, because this often leads to burnout and abandonment within the first week, which defeats the entire purpose. Instead, I want you to commit to shorter, focused daily sessions, Incorporating the listening, shadowing, labeling, narration, and speaking practices we have discussed and will continue to discuss consistently every single day for the full 30 days, treating this commitment with the same seriousness you would give to any other important daily habit in your life, brushing your teeth, taking your daily medication, exercising your body. I also want to address something practical here, because I know many of my students lead busy lives with work, family, and countless other responsibilities competing for their time and attention. The good news, based on everything we have discussed about how the brain actually builds automatic skill, is that you do not need enormous blocks of time to see real, measurable progress. 15 to 30 minutes of focused, well-structured daily practice using the specific methods outlined in this program will produce dramatically better results over 30 days than several hours of unfocused, inconsistent effort scattered irregularly throughout the same period. This should feel like genuinely good news to those of you who have felt that a lack of free time was the primary obstacle standing between you and fluency. The obstacle was never primarily about total hours available. It has always been about consistency, structure, and the correct type of daily practice, exactly what we are building together throughout this program. In the next chapter, we return to a theme we touched on earlier, the question of mistakes, but this time, I want to give you a completely practical, actionable framework for how to actually speak in real conversations, starting well before you feel fully ready, without allowing the fear of imperfection to continue holding your progress hostage. Speaking without perfection, why waiting to be ready is the mistake. I want to tell you about one of the most common patterns I see among intelligent, hardworking English learners, a pattern that, if left unaddressed, can silently sabotage years of study. I call this pattern the perfection trap, and I want you to consider honestly whether you recognize yourself in what I am about to describe. The perfection trap works like this. A learner studies English diligently for months, sometimes for years. They accumulate an impressive amount of grammar knowledge and vocabulary. But underneath this study, there is a quiet, often unconscious belief operating. A belief that says, once I know enough, once my grammar is good enough, once my vocabulary is large enough, once I feel truly ready, then I will begin actually speaking with real people in real conversations. Until that day arrives, speaking feels too risky, too embarrassing, too premature. So the learner continues studying, continues preparing, continues waiting for a feeling of readiness that, I need to tell you very honestly, almost never actually arrives on its own. Here is the uncomfortable truth I need you to hear clearly, because it may be the single most important idea in this entire program. That feeling of readiness you are waiting for is not something that comes before speaking, it is something that is created by speaking. Confidence and readiness are not prerequisites for fluent conversation. They are the results of accumulated conversational experience, including, and this is essential, a great deal of imperfect, mistake-filled, sometimes embarrassing conversational experience. There is no version of this process where you study quietly in isolation until one day you emerge fully formed and ready. Every fluent speaker you have ever admired went through an extended period of speaking imperfectly, being misunderstood, making errors, and continuing anyway. This is not a shortcut you can avoid through more preparation. This is the actual mechanism through which fluency is built. I want to explain why this is true at a deeper level, connecting back to what we discussed earlier about procedural memory and automatic skill. Remember, fluent speech is fundamentally a coordination skill closely related to physical, embodied skills like playing a sport or a musical instrument, rather than simply a body of stored factual knowledge. And coordination skills, by their very nature, cannot be built through study alone, no matter how thorough that study is. They can only be built through actual, repeated attempts at the real activity itself, attempts that will inevitably include a great many imperfect performances along the way. A person cannot become skilled at basketball by reading books about basketball, no matter how many books they read. At some point, and ideally quite early in the process, they must actually step onto the court, miss many shots, make many mistakes, and gradually, through repeated actual practice, develop real skill. Speaking English fluently follows exactly this same principle. So I want to give you a specific, practical reframing to carry with you throughout the remainder of this program, and honestly, for the rest of your English learning life. Every single conversation in which you make mistakes is not evidence that you are failing at learning English. It is direct evidence that you are actively engaged in the real process of learning English. the only process that has ever actually worked for anyone in any language throughout all of human history. I want you to begin measuring your progress not by how few mistakes you made in a conversation, but by how many real conversational attempts you made, regardless of how those attempts went. Volume of genuine attempts, not perfection of performance, is the true measure of progress at this stage. Let me give you a very practical daily structure for building this speaking practice into your 30-day program, because I do not want to leave you simply with the philosophy. I want to give you the actual method. Starting from around the second week of this program, once your listening and shadowing foundation has begun to develop, I want you to commit to at least one genuine speaking interaction every single day, even if that interaction is brief, even if it is imperfect, even if your heart races the entire time. This could take several different forms, depending on what is realistically available to you. It might be a conversation with a language exchange partner, found through one of the many language exchange platforms available today. It might be a short conversation with a colleague or classmate who speaks English. It might even be, and I say this seriously, a conversation with yourself, spoken aloud, describing your day, your opinions, your plans, recorded on your phone, if no other speaking partner is available to you on a particular day. I know that speaking to yourself out loud can feel strange at first, perhaps even a little embarrassing, especially if other people might overhear you. But I want you to understand why this practice still carries real value, even without another person present. The physical act of producing spoken English out loud in real time engages your mouth, your breath, your timing, and your live retrieval of vocabulary and grammar in a way that silent, internal practice simply cannot replicate. It builds the same procedural, automatic pathways as speaking to another person, even if it does not provide the social, conversational element of a real dialogue. I recommend combining both, real conversations with real people whenever they are available to you, supplemented by solo spoken practice on days when a real conversation partner is not accessible. There is one more element I want to add to your speaking practice, something I call the recording and review technique, which many of my students have found particularly transformative. Once or twice a week, I want you to record yourself speaking English for 2 or 3 minutes on any topic of your choosing, without excessive preparation, simply speaking naturally about your day, your thoughts, an opinion you hold. Then, and this is the important part, I want you to listen back to that recording, not with harsh self-criticism, but with genuine curiosity, as if you were a supportive coach observing a student. Notice what flowed naturally. Notice where you hesitated or reached for a word. Notice any patterns in your grammar or pronunciation that repeat across multiple recordings. This is not about creating a list of failures to feel bad about. It is about gathering real, specific, useful information about exactly where your current edges are, which then allows your daily practice to become increasingly targeted and efficient, rather than vague and unfocused. I want to close this chapter with a story about a former student of mine, a business consultant, who came to me after nearly a decade of studying English on her own, with excellent written English, but almost complete inability to speak fluently in real meetings. She told me, in our very first conversation together, that she was waiting until her speaking felt smooth before she would agree to speak more in professional settings. I explained to her exactly what I have explained to you in this chapter, and she made a decision that day to begin speaking daily, imperfectly, deliberately, without waiting for readiness. Within the first 2 weeks, she described feeling more embarrassed than ever before, because she was now regularly making mistakes in front of real colleagues, something she had successfully avoided for years by staying quiet. But by the 4th week, something had genuinely shifted. The mistakes were becoming less frequent, the hesitation was becoming shorter, and most importantly, the fear itself had noticeably softened, because she now had dozens of real experiences proving to her nervous system that speaking imperfectly did not, in fact, lead to the catastrophic social consequences her amygdala had long predicted. This is the exact transformation available to you as well, starting the moment you decide to stop waiting for perfect readiness and begin instead the real, necessary, sometimes uncomfortable work of speaking now. In the next chapter, I am going to bring together everything we have discussed so far into a clear, practical, day-by-day structure, giving you an actual daily reflex routine you can follow throughout your 30 days so that all of these principles translate into concrete, consistent action rather than remaining simply ideas you understand but never fully implement. Building your daily English reflex, the practical structure that ties everything together. We have covered a great deal of important material together so far in this program. We have discussed why translation dominates your current speech, why the silent period of focused listening matters, how neuroplasticity physically rewires your brain through repetition, how fear blocks access to language you already possess, how to train your ear through structured listening and shadowing, how to build the bridge of thinking directly in English, why daily consistency outperforms occasional intensity, and why speaking imperfectly, starting now, is the actual mechanism of progress rather than something to delay until you feel ready. Now I want to bring all of this together into a single, clear, practical daily structure, because understanding principles without a concrete daily action plan often leads to good intentions that never quite translate into consistent behavior. Here is the daily reflex routine I want you to follow, ideally at roughly the same time each day, because consistency of timing, in addition to consistency of occurrence, helps establish this practice as a true daily habit, similar to how a fixed time for exercise or meditation tends to be maintained more reliably than a floating, whenever I have time approach. I want to walk you through each component clearly so you understand not just what to do, but why each piece belongs in the sequence. Begin your daily practice with 5 to 7 minutes of focused listening, using the 3-pass method we discussed earlier in this program. Select a short piece of natural, conversational English content, ideally something connected to a genuine personal interest of yours. Listen once without subtitles, simply absorbing rhythm and general shape. Listen a second time with English subtitles, connecting sound to written word. And on your third pass, actively shadow the speaker, matching their rhythm and intonation as closely as you can, even if certain words feel awkward in your mouth at first. This opening segment trains your ear and your mouth together, warming up the direct English pathway before you move into more demanding original production later in the session. Next, spend 3 to 5 minutes on direct labeling and internal narration, the exercises we discussed in the chapter on thinking in English. Look around your immediate environment and silently or quietly aloud if you are alone, label objects and actions in English. Then move into brief internal narration, describing your current thoughts, feelings, or immediate plans in simple English sentences without worrying at all about grammatical perfection. This segment strengthens the direct connection between real, lived experience and English language access, continuing to weaken the habit of defaulting to your mother tongue first. Following this, I want you to spend 5 to 10 minutes on genuine spoken production, the heart of your daily practice. If you have access to a conversation partner, whether a language exchange partner, a colleague, a friend, or a tutor, this is the ideal time to use it, even for a brief exchange. If a partner is not available on a particular day, speak aloud to yourself, describing your day, sharing an opinion on a topic that interests you, or narrating a simple story, recording yourself on your phone if possible, so that you build a body of recordings for the weekly review practice we discussed in the previous chapter. Remember, the goal here is volume of genuine spoken attempts, not perfection. Allow yourself to make mistakes freely during this segment. Do not stop to correct every error. Keep speaking forward, the same way you would in a real live conversation, where stopping to perfect every sentence is simply not possible. After your speaking segment, I want you to spend a short amount of time, perhaps 3 to 5 minutes, on what I call targeted pattern practice. This involves choosing 1 or 2 specific grammar structures or common conversational phrases, ideally ones you noticed yourself struggling with during your speaking segment or during your weekly recording review, and practicing them specifically through several varied example sentences, spoken aloud, connecting them to your own real life whenever possible. This is different from traditional grammar study because rather than studying a rule in the abstract, you are practicing the specific pattern in active spoken use, directly building procedural memory for that particular structure, rather than simply factual knowledge about it. Finally, I want you to close your daily practice with a brief moment of reflection, no more than 1 or 2 minutes, simply noticing, without harsh judgment, how the practice felt today. Did speaking feel slightly easier than yesterday? Did a particular phrase or word come to mind more quickly than it once did? Did you notice a moment of genuine, unforced thinking in English, even briefly during your day? This reflection is not about generating a long analysis. It is about consciously noticing small signs of progress, which research on habit formation shows significantly increases motivation and consistency over time, because the brain begins to associate the practice itself with a genuine felt sense of accomplishment, rather than simply another item completed on a task list. In total, this entire daily routine takes approximately 20 to 30 minutes, a genuinely achievable commitment for the vast majority of busy adult learners, especially when compared against the years of slow, frustrated progress that often result from inconsistent, unstructured study. I want to emphasize once again that consistency across all 30 days matters far more than the intensity or perfection of any single day's session. If you miss a day, and I want to be honest with you, most learners eventually will miss at least one day across a full 30-day period. Simply return to the routine the very next day, without guilt, without treating the missed day as evidence of failure. A single missed day has a negligible effect on your overall progress. What genuinely derails progress is allowing one missed day to spiral into abandoning the entire practice altogether. Treat each day as a fresh, independent opportunity to reinforce your growing English pathways, regardless of what happened the day before. In our final chapter, I want to speak directly to you about what happens after day 30, about the realistic timeline of transformation you should genuinely expect, and about how to make sure that the progress you build during this program continues to deepen and strengthen well beyond the initial 30 days, rather than fading away once the structured program ends. Day 30, your new English brain and what comes after. We have arrived at the final chapter of our journey together, and before we close, I want to speak with you honestly, teacher to student, about what you should genuinely expect over these 30 days, and about how to protect and continue building on this progress long after the program officially ends. First, let me address expectations directly, because unrealistic expectations are one of the quiet ways learners abandon good methods too early, mistakenly believing the method has failed them, when in reality they simply misunderstood the natural timeline of this kind of deep structural change. 30 days of consistent, correctly structured practice, following everything we have discussed in this program, will not transform you into a flawless, native-like speaker with an enormous vocabulary and perfect grammar. I want to be completely honest with you about this, because I respect you too much to make promises I know are not realistic. Full mastery of any language is a lifelong journey, one that even native speakers continue throughout their entire lives, continuously learning new words, new expressions, new areas of vocabulary. However, and this is the promise I can make to you with genuine confidence, based on what I have observed across many years and many students who have followed exactly this method, 30 days of consistent practice will produce a real, noticeable, and meaningful shift in how automatically English comes to you. You will notice that certain common phrases and structures now come out smoothly without the conscious searching and translating that once slowed you down. You will notice that your ear catches natural, fast-spoken English more easily than it did 30 days ago. You will notice that the fear response before speaking has softened, even if it has not disappeared completely, because 30 days is enough time to begin genuinely retraining that threat response, even though full desensitization for some learners may take somewhat longer. Most importantly, you will have built, through direct, repeated experience, genuine proof to yourself that automatic, less translated English speech is actually possible for you, which is itself an enormously powerful shift, because so many learners carry a quiet, unexamined belief that fluency is simply not available to people like them. A belief that this program is specifically designed to dismantle through direct, lived evidence, not simply through motivational words. Now, I want to talk about what happens after day 30, because this is a moment where many learners, having built real momentum and real progress, unfortunately allow that progress to fade, simply because the structured program has ended and no clear plan exists for what comes next. I do not want this to happen to you, so let me give you clear guidance for continuing forward. The most important thing to understand is that the daily reflex routine we built together in the previous chapter is not something you should think of as a 30-day program with a fixed ending. It is, in truth, the beginning of a new, permanent daily habit, one that should ideally continue, in some form, for as long as you continue actively developing your English ability, which for most serious learners means continuing well beyond 30 days, often for many months, sometimes as an ongoing lifelong practice, though of course, as your fluency increases, the specific content and difficulty level of your daily practice should continue evolving and increasing in complexity to match your growing ability. I want to give you a simple framework for how to evolve your practice beyond day 30, so that it continues to challenge and develop you, rather than becoming stagnant or repetitive in a way that stops producing further growth. As your listening comprehension improves, gradually choose more complex, faster-paced, or more specialized content, moving beyond simple conversational material into areas such as debates, detailed interviews, professional presentations, or specialized topics connected to your particular field or interests. As your speaking becomes more fluent in everyday general topics, gradually push yourself into more challenging conversational territory, discussing more complex opinions, more nuanced topics, more professional or specialized subject matter relevant to your actual life and goals. The core method, the daily combination of focused listening, direct labeling and narration, genuine spoken production, and targeted pattern practice, remains the same, but the specific content and difficulty level should continue rising steadily, ensuring your brain continues to be appropriately challenged, which is essential for continued growth, since a brain practicing only comfortable, already mastered material will naturally plateau over time. I also want to address something important about maintaining motivation over the longer term, beyond these initial 30 days, because sustained motivation across months, rather than simply weeks, is often the true differentiator between learners who eventually reach genuine fluency and those who make good initial progress but eventually stop before reaching their full potential. I want to encourage you to find ways to connect your English practice to genuinely meaningful, real-world goals and experiences, rather than treating it as an abstract, disconnected study task. Perhaps this means setting a goal of confidently leading a meeting in English within a certain number of months. Perhaps this means planning to travel somewhere and use your English in real, unscripted interactions with new people. Perhaps this means connecting with a community of other learners, or even native English speakers, who can provide ongoing social connection and accountability around your continued practice. Language, at its deepest level, is not simply an academic subject to be mastered in isolation. It is a tool for genuine human connection, for opportunity, for self-expression, for accessing ideas and relationships and experiences that would otherwise remain closed to you. Staying connected to these deeper, meaningful reasons behind your English learning journey will sustain your motivation far more reliably over the long term than simply focusing on abstract measures of grammatical accuracy or vocabulary size. Before we close, I want to return to something I said at the very beginning of this video, because I believe it deserves to be repeated clearly now that you have walked through this entire journey with me. You do not have an intelligence problem. You do not have a talent problem. You never did. What you have had, up until this point, is a translation-dominant brain wiring, built unintentionally through years of a particular kind of study, combined with an amygdala trained through painful past experiences to treat English speaking as a genuine social threat. Both of these things, the wiring of your language pathways and the sensitivity of your threat response, are changeable through exactly the kind of consistent, correctly structured, daily practice we have laid out together throughout this program. This is not a hopeful guess on my part. This is grounded in real, well-established brain science, and it is confirmed again and again by the real lived transformations of countless students who have walked this exact path before you, many of whom began exactly where you are beginning today, frustrated, translating, freezing in real conversations despite years of study, and who, through consistent daily practice over weeks and months, ultimately became confident, automatic, fluent English speakers. I want to leave you with one final, direct instruction, the single most important action you can take right now, in this exact moment, immediately after finishing this video. Do not close this video and simply think, "That was an interesting and helpful explanation. I will begin properly tomorrow, or next week, once I have prepared, once I have found the perfect content, once conditions feel more ideal." I want you, right now, in the next 5 minutes, to do just one small piece of what we discussed today. Look around the room you are sitting in, right now, and silently label 3 objects in English. Notice one thought in your mind, right now, and silently express it in a simple English sentence, in your head. This tiny action, done right now, is the actual first step of the 30 days we have discussed, and I promise you, beginning immediately, even in this small way, dramatically increases the likelihood that you will actually follow through with this practice consistently, compared to waiting for some imagined perfect future starting point that for so many learners, unfortunately never quite arrives. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I am Professor Henry, and this has been English Mind Training. I have taught this method to many students, and I have watched it work again and again for people just like you, people who believed before we began working together that fluent automatic English speaking was simply not available to them. I promise you, it is available to you. It requires no special talent you do not already possess. It requires only the correct method, applied consistently, day after day, exactly as we have laid out together in this program. Begin today, begin now, in this very moment. Your new English brain is not something you need to wait for. It is something you are already beginning to build, starting with the very next thought you choose to think in English. I will see you in the next lesson.